Welcome to Clinical Learning Reimagined, the podcast for health professions educators who believe that improving clinical learning from the beginning is a passion worth reimagining. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Fall, founder and CEO of Aquifer. Each episode, I sit down with a boots-on-the-ground clinician or basic science educator and thought leader, visionary innovator, or leading researcher who saw an emerging problem or need and courageously started to address it, asking hard questions, testing long-held assumptions, and pursuing bold new ideas and building towards something better for all of us during the most disruptive times our field has ever seen. These are real conversations with people working at the forefront, the ones I believe are best positioned to help us envision the way forward and build on their work. So, pull up a chair and let's reimagine together.
Good day, everyone. Today I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Michelle Daniel, Professor of Emergency Medicine at the University of California, San Diego, and Vice Dean for Medical Education. Michelle is a fellow of the American College of Emergency Physicians and holds a master's in health professions education from the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. She's a past president of the Directors of Clinical Skills, or DOCS, organization, and is currently serving as an associate editor for the journal Medical Teacher, as well as co-chairing the journal's Best Evidence in Medical Education Review Committee, an international evidence synthesis collaboration with AMEE, or AMY. Michelle is a rare combination of practicing clinician, educator, researcher, and scholar whose work combines an impressive degree of breadth and depth about how we think and learn to think like clinicians. I wanted to sit down with Michelle and hear, before her newest reviews hit the journals, given everything we understand traditionally about clinical competency development so far, what is she thinking now? So, Michelle, welcome to Clinical Learning Reimagined.
Thank you.
So at the outset, I'd just love to hear more about your own journey, into medicine, into medical education, into research. Were there any, especially pivotal moments for you that told you, this is my path?
Well, I would say my journey was a little bit unconventional. And I think that really helped shape the way for how I approach medical education today. Mm-hmm. So when I finished residency, I actually went directly into practice as an attending in the community. And I already had one daughter at that point. I was crazy enough to have a daughter as an intern, and I had another on the way. And so for me, pursuing a fellowship right out of residency simply wasn't going to be the right path at that point in my life. So eventually, though, I kind of found my way back to academic medicine, and I became increasingly involved in clinical skills education. And I think that that's actually where our paths first crossed.
Yeah.
And then that was where I started noticing something that I really just couldn't quite let go of. We spend an enormous amount of time thinking about how physicians learn medicine, right. But the people doing the teaching, they're really largely basic scientists and clinicians. And while many of them are really extraordinary teachers, relatively few of us have actually had any formal training in the science behind education.
Right.
And so I began to wonder, what do we actually know about how people learn to become physicians? And how much of what we do in med ed is actually based on evidence and theory versus, tradition and intuition? Mm-hmm. So those questions kind of really stuck with me. And so about a decade, I think, into my career and a decade into my journey as a mom, I actually went back to school and I pursued that master's degree that you mentioned in health professions education at Maastricht in the Netherlands. Not a bad place to have to be.
Not at all.
So glad I did it before it became a more online experience.
Yeah.
And that really, really changed the trajectory of my career. And I would say I became really fascinated by two things. And the first was theory. And I came to appreciate that theory really gives us a way to explain why something happens, not simply just observe that it happens. And so I have to confess, I am a bit of a theory wonk.
You really? And your papers, no one would
at
all know that's true.
That by reading my papers. And so I genuinely love thinking about theory, and particularly theories of clinical reasoning. They're my passion. How do physicians think? How does expertise develop? Why does reasoning sometimes fail? How does the environment influence how we think and make decisions? And then the second thing that I became very passionate about was evidence. And I became very interested in evidence synthesis and systematic reviews, and hence my work with BEAMI. And, how can we take this enormous fragmented body of medical education research and actually turn it into something that educators can actually use? And so to me, evidence synthesis is really this incredibly powerful tool, because it can make decades of scholarship accessible to somebody who's trying to make a decision about a curriculum, an assessment program, or a policy. And so when I look back, I really think the thread running through my entire career has really been curiosity about those two things. How can theory help us understand what we're seeing, and how can evidence help us decide what we should do about it?
Oh, it helps explain for me so much of why I think our paths have been so complementary to each other. Because it's interesting. For me, I had a very similar start like you, out there and being a resident and a chief resident, and all of a sudden, same thing. It's wait a minute, this is really complex teaching and learning. And how do people learn how to do this? And yet we're teaching people to be, clinicians, doctors, PAs, nurse practitioners, and none of us, we're all really good at being students, but none of us really learned how to be teachers. And for me, what's interesting is what really caught my attention was curricular structure, was the learning objectives. What are we teaching, and why are we teaching that and not that? And how do we organize that? And which laid the groundwork for the teaching theories and the assessment theories and everything else. And so I think for me, looking for somebody, it's I needed those things, but that wasn't my first passion. You were doing a lot of these things because it was your first passion. And then you were how can I give this to people who are boots in the ground? And I was thank goodness. And I think sometimes we really appreciated that each other had done the other side of that work. And kind of brought it together to kind of move it forward. So that makes a lot of good sense. So what are you working on now that excites you the most? Before we dive into some sort of past work and how it applies today, what you got on your plate? What's kind of keeping you excited today?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think I'm most excited about right now is a question that I really think medical education is having to confront very quickly, which is how should we teach clinical reasoning in a world where artificial intelligence is increasingly a part of clinical practice? And despite what my age might suggest, I am not a Luddite. I'm actually tremendously excited about these new technologies and what they might make possible. But I also think that we need to be thoughtful, and we're probably not being quite cautious enough right now. And so the challenge is that AI has not exactly arrived at a leisurely pace. Here all of us, we were just still emerging from COVID and thinking, oh my God, moved to this total flexible learning space. And I had barely wrapped my head around all of the changes that have happened in medical education in the last 5 years. And now AI. And so it kind of feels like this freight train is coming down the tracks at us. And medical education really hasn't had the luxury of saying, hey, give us 5 years to study this really carefully and develop a conceptual framework, and then we'll decide how to incorporate it. So it's here. Your learners are using it, my learners are using it, our clinicians are using it, and now we have to figure out how to use it well. And so I've really, gone back to my theory roots, and I've been approaching the problem through the lens of, how should theory guide us right now? And so one of the foundational theories that we use to think about clinical reasoning is it's dual process theory. And so in really simplified terms, that proposes that we reason through processes that range from these like rapid, intuitive, pattern-based thinking to slower, deliberate, analytical thinking. And as we clinicians develop our expertise, we build up this incredibly rich mental representation of disease. And eventually, as an experienced clinician, we can walk into a room and very quickly recognize, I've seen this pattern before. And the rapid recognition isn't necessarily a shortcut or a bad reasoning. It's a hallmark of our expertise. But that's where AI is going to make things interesting. Because if a learner can ask an AI system for a differential diagnosis before they've developed those mental representations, those illness scripts for themselves, what happens to the development of expertise? And so that's where I think we have to worry about something that you've heard in the literature talked about, which is never skilling. And so if technology performs a cognitive task before you've ever had to learn to perform that task yourself, you simply may never develop the underlying cognitive structures that allow you to know whether the technology's answer makes sense. But that's only one side of the story. So for me, there's this whole other family of theories that I've talked about in my work called situativity theories that really tell us that cognition, it doesn't just reside in my head or an individual's head. Our reasoning actually emerges through interactions between myself, the environment, all the other people in my environment, including the patients, the nurses, the pharmacists, and all the tools that are available to us, including the internet and now AI. And so if you use that perspective, AI doesn't necessarily sit outside clinical reasoning. It can actually happen and become part of the reasoning system, kind of as an extension of the clinician's cognitive environment. And so I think that opens up really extraordinary possibilities. So I think the question for MedEd right now isn't simply, should learners use AI? They're going to use it. It's much more interesting than that. We need to be asking, when should they use it? For what cognitive tasks and at what stage in their development is actually appropriate? Because the risks are actually different along the developmental continuum from UME to GME to clinical practice. And so for a novice, the greatest risk might be never skilling, outsourcing a cognitive task before you've developed the skill yourself. But as the learner becomes more experienced, I'm going to worry more about, are they misskilling? Are they developing ways of reasoning that are maybe too shaped by technology, including inappropriate shortcuts or failing to recognize when the tool is actually wrong? Then for our experienced clinicians, the greater concern might be de-skilling and losing the cognitive abilities that we've developed because we've now delegated them to technology. I see that happening in our clinical world right now as a lot of our physicians are letting note writing happen through ambient.
Right.
So I think that, this is really incredibly important, but the story shouldn't just be about risk. Because at every one of those developmental stages, I think that there's also the possibility of upskilling with AI. And that's really cool. And so imagine AI systems that can actually understand where an individual learner is developmentally and provide exactly the right amount of cognitive support at exactly the right moment. And they could challenge a learner's differential diagnosis. They might expose them to alternative hypothesis. They could identify gaps in their illness scripts or deliberately increase complexity of cases that are presented to them as expertise develops.
Yep.
And I think that's where this connects to another area that I'm really excited about, which is precision education. And using, just that idea of using data and technology to tailor education to the needs of an individual learner. And so The future that I'm really interested in isn't one where we teach physicians to reason without AI. And it isn't one where we simply hand over reasoning to AI. It's this developmental model where we can just deliberately teach physicians when to reason independently, when to reason with technology, and how to know the difference. And I think if we get that right, I think AI could do something much more interesting than simply make clinicians more efficient as a work tool. It could actually help us develop better thinkers, and that could be really cool.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, once again, I think you and I are thinking very similarly. Let me ask one of the questions that's been sort of bugging me, though, along those lines. Kind of maybe two questions that are, given what you said, because I'm completely, for the most part, on board with what you said. But I think both of us being, relative pragmatists, for me, the first one is this. If you imagine AI rolling out now, you have to imagine it is rolling out right now. The more seasoned one gets, the more you've had a traditional experience, the more you've had, as you said, the things that we are concerned about, what will the impact be? Well, we've had those experiences all along the way. And so the interesting thing for me to be thinking about right now is, so I sort of imagine like these layers of expertise development and cognitive development and experience and context and everything else, up to people who've been in practice for a couple of decades, all the way down to our entering medical students who actually had a fair amount of AI in college already. Hard to believe, but with 3-4 years in college, they've already been playing with it. So when you have those layers, almost like archaeological layers, but now you have AI hitting all at once at those layers. And then, of course, those layers are going to continue to evolve as the more seasoned clinicians retire, come back as teachers, as the youngest novices are actually developing their expertise with AI. How are you thinking about essentially this model of where you have all these different layers of expertise, but one big change happening all at once to all of them? Tell me a little bit about your own thinking in that regard.
I think that this is one of the biggest challenges of our time. The challenge for us, though, at least in my space, is I have to start thinking about what is the knowledge architecture that the youngest physician is going to need to interact with AI in the future. And my God, somebody forgot to drop my crystal ball off to tell me
I have a wand. I'm going to lend it to you.
Future is actually going to look like, because right now we can only imagine it. But I do think theory helps us understand foundational things about knowledge architecture. And if we allow that, so there would be a pathway to say, okay, you physicians coming up, we're not even going to worry about you developing illness scripts and the ability to then contextualize them in clinical environments, because AI is going to do that for you. What happens when the power goes out, or when the hacker comes into your system and suddenly you don't have the knowledge architecture that needed to be built along the way to deal with that scenario? So that's in my sort of doomsday thinking. I'm like, but we still have to develop the right knowledge architecture. And we also have to do it because AI is also getting better and better at fooling us and making things sound really great that maybe aren't accurate. And you almost have to be better and better at what you do in order to recognize when it goes awry. And so I think that that's what we have to think about, and then think about how can we leverage, as I mentioned before, AI to do that precision education faster. How can we ensure people are getting exposed to lots of different case variation, different case complexity, layer that in right when you're in the perfect zone of proximal development to develop that next skill. And then, in the clinical setting, I don't know about you all, but we've been having a lot of discussions around, when is the right time to allow ambient scribing for residents? Or when is the right time to allow medical decision making? And I think that, you have to learn how to write a note. And there's also a synthesis process that happens cognitively when you are putting together a note and you're putting together your assessment and plan, that if you eliminate that processing because you've offloaded it to a computer, you may not have thought as deeply about the case. And that's that time when you'll miss things. And so I think, I don't know, those are just some of my preliminary thoughts.
I love your term, knowledge architecture. And for me, one of the things I'd love to hear your thoughts on is this idea of concepts, of our conceptual reasoning, of using things that are principally true and conserved in how the human body functions and how it can be applied to what we know about clinical medicine as well. Do you think concepts can serve as part of that knowledge architecture that students may have to sort of know before they're allowed to work with AI to tell them what's going on?
I think that the problem with conceptual knowledge is there are big picture concepts, things like understanding the process of inflammation that allow you to understand a lot of different diseases. And so I do think that there is absolutely a foundational role for some conceptual understanding. It's really this idea that you can learn broad conceptual principles, but then each time you have to figure out how to learn about it with that specific content in that specific context, because it's going to manifest differently. And right now we have a little bit of a tendency to teach the broad conceptual model and sort of some of those foundational science principles, and then we actually never link it to the actual workplace-based learning, which is highly contextualized. And that's something I think that work on basic and clinical science integration was really trying to do, was to say, you actually have to integrate that knowledge in the moment. It's not good enough that you taught it over here.
Right.
And now you're going to see this thing over here. If you don't have somebody who is guiding you through integration of that knowledge, it may never get integrated. Then the actual more robust knowledge architecture won't be built.
Right. And I think I heard you say, like I said, so that idea that illness scripts and conceptual understanding, in a more conserved way than applied, like you said, in the workplace, may enable what I'm about ready to turn to, which is some master adaptive learning. Thank you so much for tuning into Clinical Learning Reimagined and my conversation with Dr. Daniel today. The conversation will continue in our next episode. Be on the lookout for that, and be sure to subscribe wherever you get podcasts. And don't forget, you can also watch them on YouTube as well.
Thank you for listening today. I hope we've left you inspired. For more on how Aquifer is moving health professions education forward, visit us at aquifer.org/clinical-learning-reimagined. Onwards and upwards.